Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings, a listening library for critical conversation, reflection, and collective knowing. This space is rooted in the beliefs that knowledge must remain accountable to the people and communities from which it emerges. In this episode, Research at the Edge, Reflexivity, Risk in Working with Women, I am in conversation with Deborah McFee. Together, we enter the ethical, emotional, and political terrain of conducting research within marginalized Caribbean communities, particularly in relation to violence against women. This is a conversation about what it means to work at the edge of trauma and testimony, at the edge of community and advocacy, at the edge of research that demands more than observation, distance, or neutrality. Deborah and I reflect on moral and relational commitment, one that asks us to stand with rather than over the women whose lives and stories we engage. We sit with discomfort, responsibility, and risk. We ask what it means to be accountable beyond the data, to carry stories carefully, and to practice research as an act of solidarity, courage, and care.
I am grateful to be here with you. Thank you to reason in your salt water, not our salt water.
So Deb, let me ask, when I send this invitation and say we're going to have saltwater reasonings, what came to your mind and what drew you to agree to say yes?
Well, firstly, you asked. So you asked. I don't have to say anything else really. But in all honesty, I've been thinking about this series for a while now. And I find that we talk a lot about the decolonial, and I am just fascinated really by the saltwater reasonings, really. So I appreciated the opportunity. I am here, honored and grateful.
I think in this part of the world, saltwater comes for me out of the fact that we live on an island that's completely surrounded by saltwater. As you know, saltwater has healing capacities. We grew up in communities where the remedy for anything that might be feeling good is you need some salt. I think it also ties to our ancestral lineage. This global South conversation is about how we embody this world with the histories that we have. And that history for the Caribbean is very diverse, right? There is the Middle Passage. We also have a huge South Asian population, so there's also that passage. The fact that we've come from many places. We are a place marked by importation and marked by violence. We have that in our history. Yeah. I want to center us with that today. In a real way, Deborah, we've always dealt with vulnerability. I think this region has been built around vulnerability. I want us to arrive by asking you to share a little bit about how you came to work with women in community settings and around gender-based violence. I want us to start there.
Thank you so much. We are marked by importation. I'm taking that.
Yeah.
I promise you, I will, of course, identify the source. My work really started in the Ministry of Community Development, Culture, and Women's Affairs, Gender Affairs, many moons ago. And the work really was around how do you ensure that government funding is spent on the people. I had a permanent secretary who said to me many moons ago that the best thing to do with government funds is to spend it on government people. The people, the population, we must make sense of what is going on with the population. And I could call his name. That was if people were concerned. And my work started really in that space. How do we make sense of it? now Dr. Wilkins, he was the permanent secretary, but there were a number of persons also working through gender. Gender was new. Gender came to Women's Affairs in 1994. 1994, Trinidad and Tobago was the first country to enter in this IDB grant project that institutionalized gender affairs. And that work was seminal in the region. And you ask how it came to working with gender-based violence. The one programming area that everybody agreed upon that we needed particular attention being paid to was gender-based violence. By 94, Trinidad had already passed its Domestic Violence Act. We were the first to pass that act in the region. And what we were looking at, though, is that the passage of the act was fine because it was an all of CARICOM activity. So we're building on the CARICOM legislation. There was draft legislation that allowed countries to pick up and run with this. So we're building on all of that and all the legislation. And that was the area that everyone agreed there was some kind of work that had to be done. I mean, and this was nationally, this was regionally, this was globally. We recognized that it was the one area that tied us together in terms of what work needed to be done.
You mentioned your permanent secretary, and I feel like we need to pause for a little while just to talk a little bit about the energy that is Ifeoma Wilkinson. And, when he said that the government money should be spent on the people, Dr. Wilkinson has always been, for me, somebody who's been about working with the people. So he came up through Best Village. He's known as a playwright. So he's also bridging public affairs, the government business, but also culture and the work of the people. When you think about that ministry, being in community affairs, so it seems like gender and community in that first manifestation of the institutionalization of gender in government service, like there is that meeting of community and gender, and it seems like the energy of people who understood that gender is public business, it's public health, which is where we've come to now, right? That gender is not, and gender-based violence is not an individual issue, but it's an issue that engages and is about the community. Did you know it at that time, or do you see it now? If you could reflect a little bit on that.
So Dr. Wilkinson in himself, the force that he is, brought to my understanding, I should say our understanding, that combination. And there's a way in which Joan Yule Williams, the Honorable Minister at the time, someone who always appreciated the Best Village, the community development, she saw the need for gender or women's affairs. She understood that for us to do that work, it had to be grounded in a community engagement with the issues of women and the issues of gender. And so what was for me instructive in that moment and being in that space was looking at the ways in which Dr. Wilkinson, as the Chief Financial Officer, is reminding us all the time that this work is your responsibility to the community and community development. And that time, interestingly, the person who was in charge of gender, there was a unit dedicated to gender-based violence, Monica Williams. She was an old community development supervisor. So you have persons who are invested in the work of communities. The thing is, there's another aspect to Dr. Wilkinson that I find interesting is he would always remind me, every so often, he would say, understand this, that he worked with Phyllis Augustus when Women's Affairs was a desk, a bureau in social development. And he said culture was also kind of just at the side there. And so he has a reasoning that says, I understand what it is to be in a government space not fully understood. Because if you think about gender, if you think about culture, there's a way in which they roll around the government machinery. And so if he was reminding us that, listen, that may be so, but it can't roll around the community. The community requires you to engage in this work with a particular mindfulness. So in terms of Dr. Wilkinson being our chief administrator, and we had this minister at a time who understood community development. Even now,
Yes.
Honorable Minister Joan Williams was someone who saw the need. And I don't know that gender and community development has come together a lot since then. But I would say to you, it was a different moment because in my younger age and grounding me in the work that I do, Monica Williams would say to me, we have 22 drop-in centers across Trinidad. And the drop-in centers are to offer support for persons dealing with any kind of gender-based violence or any kind of violation within the communities. I pause in here. Talk to me, Tracie.
Listen, so many places, so many things coming to mind. One is just the power of leaders, and we're talking about people who had a vision and knew how to communicate it. We're talking about people who were working in the government machinery but understood their commitment to the communities that we serve. And there's so much about that that just really moves me. Like when I think about the kind of academic work that we should be doing, it should always be work that is connected to people. And I think that's, let me not go on that soapbox, but I think that's when we lose our way, when we forget that ultimately we are public servants, in the academy, we are public servants. And if we're not doing public service, what we doing? Something wrong. So that strikes me. And then I'm also thinking about, and this leads into my other question. So you're coming from this place, you're going into communities, you then go on to become a researcher. So there is this, I want to call it a threshold of advocate, researcher, as well as public officer. So I want to ask a little bit about what it meant to cross the threshold from observer to advocate, and then to move into researcher and witness.
The first thing, it's easier for me to self-identify as a public servant. My mother is a public servant. She deals with statistics. So in my house, you live on statistics and having conversations about when unemployment goes here and unemployment goes there, and And I remember in her public service life, she would go to communities to pick up prices. And sometimes you will go with her. And so you will get a sense of the difference in the price of chicken between Enterprise and St. James, for example. And she picks up this data and they have to do a basket of goods calculation. But really what they're doing is that they are creating a socioeconomic pulse for us as a population. They're feeding into the data sets that give us an understanding of what is being experienced across Trinidad.
Yeah.
Chicken is the one meat that we eat all the time. Yeah.
I
So
just,
she,
I want to interrupt you, Deborah, just for people who are listening to us outside of Trinidad and Tobago are not familiar with the Trinidad and Tobago context. We talking about geographical spread. We're talking about class. We're talking about the price of one thing in a rural area compared to the price of the same thing
The
in a
same
urban,
thing.
which is
That's right.
accessible by a different population, which oftentimes differ in ethnicity, in class, and
That's right.
socioeconomic background.
And the thing is, what I find fascinating with the government machinery is that there were these roles established in the government machinery that allowed us that kind of insight. It was important that on a monthly basis, public servants get out there and understand person's capacity to access basic food. There was a list and the information was gotten. All that to say, my interest in research has a lot to do with with her in these different communities, basically, and getting a sense of these differences. When you cross over, what does South Trinidad pricing looks like vis-a-vis Central, vis-a-vis Northwest? And, those, to me, those are very important aspects of public policy. So my interest really started with her. And then I go into gender, working in gender affairs as a clerk and enjoying that work, and then moving into the project work. The transition out of the public service into the Institute for Gender and Development Studies was really about an opportunity to work on a national gender policy with Professor Pat Mohammed. And again, another research activity, and it was the national gender policy of the Commonwealth of Dominica. So you are looking at this panoramic picture that Professor Mohammed is now called upon to engage with, and you get to work with her. Completely different island to Trinidad. When you begin to look at the data would always be fascinating to me, and you begin to work through and unpack what is it I'm looking at in the context of that national lens, and then you actually get to go there and do work around that policy. So that is captured. And then a little while after that, I returned to the Institute for Gender and Development as the outreach officer. Um, the outreach officer is really a most fascinating post because you are now called upon it's outreach and research. So to me, it is doing what you've always done. You're working with the exact areas of concern that you outlined way back in 98 when Trinidad was grappling with implementing your domestic violence bill and preparing for CEDAW. It's amazing how you are then called upon to engage as a researcher, as a scholar, but more so around advocating for different ways of being. It goes on. It really goes on. This work does not stop. This work does not stop.
Fascinated by just the shift between young Deborah going to out with Heather McFee to the supermarket and looking at the price of chicken in different communities, and then Deborah working with Patricia Mohammed, Prof. Mohammed. I know we have talked often about the women that show up in our lives, and in a country like Trinidad and Tobago, the diversity of women and the ways in which they care. And I'm going to put you on the spot, and I want to ask you to just reflect on just the way that these two women who could seem like worlds apart,
how these two women were so instrumental to you in shaping the researcher you are.
Deborah McFee, my mother, she's a serious woman, you know that. She's a serious woman. She is very dedicated to task. And there's a way in which she engaged with her work as a public servant very seriously. And that also meant that as public service children, we understood. We understood when our unemployment rate dipped. And she always reminded us of the numbers. She said to us, there are 5,000 leaving fifth form this year. We don't have 5,000 jobs to give to them. So it's very important that you excel in whatever you do because it's 5,000. And she would always remind us. So as a family, the news was very important because the price of oil was important. The number of barrels going out was important and what was going on in Trinidad. Professor Mohammed now, interestingly, I met Professor Mohammed in The Hague. She is in the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, where I did my master's. She did her PhD there. And one of our lecturers one day, Mohammed Sali, he came to me. He was from Sudan. And he said, your countrywoman is here. And I said, well, who is that? Mohammed says, he grabs my hand. He comes and he says, come here. And he introduces me to Professor Mohammed. It's the first time I met her. And she's cordial. She has just released Gendered Realities, which is her 2003 book. And I mean, everybody has a copy of Gendered Realities. If you don't have one, you need to get one. And I met her and that was it. She was very cordial, very, how are you doing? That kind of engagement. It was good to meet her. She was a Caribbean academic. It was only 3 of us. There were only 4 Caribbean students in an entire school. And of course, we were loudest and you heard us. But we were, of course, on the shoulders of the Pats and the Rhodas and the Joan Rollins, Imani Tofarai, Ama, all people who had gone through this space in this very, very wide space. But Caribbeanness is this amazing asset. You are in The Hague and you're in a school that most of the class is Asian and African. But just being from the Caribbean, you come into the space and you fill up your space differently. As I said, it was just the 4 of us. The MSc level at the time, 1 Grenada, 1 Bahamas, 2 Trinis, 1 male, 3 women. And I'm not talking about the joyfulness of Caribbeanness. I'm not talking about the fact that you walk into the space and just saying good morning the way we do. Making really good friends with both the guard and the principal and understanding that you need to be good friends with both the people who went before us, the Denise Noel, the Beaks, and there was Miss Harrison, who was responsible for CARICOM statistics for a long time. Those persons went before us with a certain level of academic excellence. So we were really in this space with a certain level of expectation as Caribbeans, as they used to call us, the Caribbeans, and also just being ourselves, laughing too hard, laughing too much, finding a way to make community. And I think that is important. how we make community. We can talk to anybody and we make community with anybody. And I think we underestimate the power of that capacity to speak with, not to or at, but speak with, and settling and just learning people. And that was my first glimpse into understanding who we are. Claudius Prevail from St. Lucia. And I said, Eastern Caribbean, quote unquote, big island, small island, we small up inside of there. And that it's all of us, Jamaica, and all of us small there. But we understand how to make community. And I think that is important, particularly in this moment. In this moment where you almost want to invalidate community, I think community is even more important as we move forward.
I wanted to take us to this next thing. I don't know if you remember saying this to me, but we had a conversation years ago. I was doing some GBV projects at the time, talking about what it is to work with women, to find out what women in abusive situations really need, how to be of service to them, how to do that ethically. And you said something to me that went like, and I'm roughly saying this. You said, the woman don't want me to take the man away. She just want me to stop him from beating. So this sense that sometimes we go into a space as for me, doing social work as a community worker, and we come from the university where we learned, this is what women need to feel safe. And then we go in there to bring safety. Like we can bring safety. But if we listen, we hear people asking us for different things. And what we think people want and what people are asking us for, it's not always the same thing. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but I think that's one of the when we talk about gender-based violence, and I hear a lot of people talk about gender-based violence, and I'm not sure that we always speak about it with the nuance that it requires. But that story always comes to mind.
I remember the woman who said to me, and I always remember her, my husband is a good man, He's drink too much, and I want my husband. I want my husband. I want the leg sister, but I want my husband. I remember I want my husband. And so my reasoning on this, so the thing is, we talk about gender as this thing that evolves over time, but I've often found that our engagement with issues of gender relations, our consciousness evolves over time also. So in that moment, being very young and hearing that, I am thrown. I'm not joking. I am thrown. I always say there are some people have these pointers. These spiritual Baptists have pointers when you go to mourn. There are people who direct you. And one of my pointers, I guess the Western way to say it would be the mentors. One of my pointers, but the saltwater way is pointers. These people who come into your life and put you in a direction. Filade Matuta. Filade Matuta reminds me constantly of who you're talking to. So you see that woman who is saying, what I want must center in the work that we do. I'm in no way advocating for people to remain in abusive relationships. But what I've made peace with is the fact that our public policy response does not allow me to care for my children in the way that they have grown accustomed to and leave. If I leave and I go to the shelter, my children can no longer go to school. And so I do recognize that in the midst of a public policy response that we've come to over time, it does not really make room for the complexities of people's lives. The fact that I have to go to school, the fact that I have to go to work, the fact that I have to provide in a particular way. And I'm not, understand what I'm saying. The public policy response has to come from a space of standardization many times. And so working through those nuances becomes very expensive. So one of the things I'm grappling with now, and one of the things I'm looking at, and one of the things I've learned very recently is I was in a data collection exercise, and one of the women from the shelter said to us, I have to work out how to provide schooling for the children that are in the shelters. And she's also saying, I have to work out schooling for children who are, understand this, many times in violent relationships for a long time and have gaps in learning. So for public policy in small islands that are not very liquid, to make space for all of that is very difficult. And I think that in itself is something that we need to spend time deliberating on in terms of what do you say? How do you come to a response around GBV makes sense for people's lives?
Deb, I'm also hearing, as an educator, how do we teach our students to engage in that way? What to do with, my husband is a good man. I like my husband. Is he drinking and he licks? And sometimes when we teach, we don't make space for that nuance. So sometimes I feel there are students coming out there ready to go into communities to talk about heteronormativity. But really, like, how does heteronormativity help me, So I think that's such a important nexus there. Now, one of the things I say in the intro to Saltwater Reasonings is that we don't have all of the answers, but it's for us to start thinking through and then thinking aloud, and admitting that we don't have all of the answers, but thinking through some of these issues, the fact that the public policy has to be standardized, but our people are not standardized. And they're definitely not standardized in ways that they are in theory and the ways that they are in our textbooks. So then we have a gap. And in that gap, I am often worried that we're churning out young professionals that do not know how to be with people who are not standardized, who are nuanced. How to do that in a way that's not judgmental, that's deeply compassionate, and that leaves a space for us to sit with.
I do a course
To
for
sit
key
with the gray. Yeah.
issues in gender and development. And it's a very fascinating course. Professor Jean Popper, another mentor, was the person who came up with this course. And you get to choose issues in Caribbean development and you get to unpack it. And unpack it with a gender lens. After years of doing this, my message has been whittled down to one thing. It's more complicated than that. Any social problem that we come to with one remedy is problematic. So when we talk about crime is a problem, is them boys are going to school. Crime is those single narratives that we lay hold to and we become invested in. Crime is a problem, them single parent family, them again, I've whittled it down to one thing. And Jane always used to say that to me. And Filade says it to me. She says it's more complicated than that. And our responsibility, I think, particularly in the academy, is to come to the complications. And we need to engage our students in a way that says to them, it's more complicated than that. So you tell me how complicated you think this is. So for me, that is, that is my thing. I'm asking them. I'm saying, it's more complicated. You tell me where your complication starts. So some might say my complication starts at the point of gender, or I see this problem as those fathers. But I say, what else? And I think it is a way of us to pointing our students and forcing them to not become the saviors of the world. Because for us to deal with it in a complicated way would be for us. Fundamental to that is for us to listen. Because my point of starting is here. But my lady friend who informed me that is her husband, is her lover, the father of her children, the this and that, all these things. Therefore, he's not only the person who is beating her. I need help, and I need to hear that. I need to listen. It doesn't matter what I think, because if I come to it understanding, and we use these nice words, we use social justice, and we use equity, and we use all these cutesy words. Because if I came to it very clearly understanding that, guess what, if this is a social justice lens, it didn't validate her humanity, neither can I. My core responsibility would be to hear what she has to say. But this is a gender equity lens. Then the relationship of this research cannot be that what I say goes. What she has to say has as much value as what I do, what I have to say. And so it's an ongoing thing. But this is where I am right now. It's more complicated than that. That's all I can say.
It's more complicated than that. I think that's such a powerful place to land. Yeah. One of the audience sectors for this reasoning, students, right? Coming from that, because there's so much work that's going on simultaneously, right? I'm thinking also about the emotional labor of being in close contact with women's stories of harm, and the secondary trauma sometimes that also entails, because it's more complicated than that. I am being present, but there's a thing that doing this work does to you. And I always say to my students, I want it to always do that thing to me, because when it stops disturbing me, then I can no longer do this work, right? But I also have to manage the disturbance, because if it disturbs me to the point that it disturbs my ability to be in relationship with my family and with my inner community, then it's also problematic. How have you managed?
I never sit alone. When we do this work, we are. So a big chunk of the conversations I'm having these days is with the Women's Institute for Alternative Development, WINAD, and they're having their women's conversations over the years. And you go into communities, you hear, but you're not alone. So a big part of it is having the conversations with the women before. Persons that you're going in with, your researchers, whether they're students, whether they're older women, you're going into the community. I remember being younger on the bus, and Merle Hodge is on the bus, and Jackie Burgess is on the bus, and they're talking, and you're getting ready to go into Princestown, and you're going into these communities that those of us who born on the East-West corridor of Trinidad, you don't know. And you know what? Conversation among women prior to just talking is a way in which talk heals. And you're talking going in. And then I always remember those years, Nadine Lois Agard would be our facilitator. So Nadine would never leave a session. You'd never leave a session with Nadine not recognizing, one, the need for confidentiality and honoring, but also the need for us to acknowledge and thank those who have shared, but also for us as women to share some time after, just to chat, just to be. And I think a lot of times we forget how important those aspects of the work can be, because what it is, it's allowing a sharing, it's allowing an unburdening, it's allowing those of us to who are inside there to recognize that collectively we are in this thing. And I think those parts of the work that allow us to be, and those parts of the work that allow us to return, because many times we have a picture of these women in our hands. They're not victim. So the parts of the work that allow us to return and know that I made a life beyond this also brings with it a kind of rest. And so it is not always easy. But for me, I value the conversations, the prep. I value the intergenerational learnings that has been a part of this work, because people like Jackie Burgess, they are instrumental in establishing things like rape crisis. They were the people who started to build consciousness around working women. Verena Calhoun, Merle, as I said, the Verna, all these women are really instrumental in bringing us this language around gender-based violence. So when you go in with them, you go in talking, you go in learning, you go in listening from the get-go. So I don't know if I answer your question, but I think it's really important to talk about this thing.
You did. You did. And just a moment to just say her name, Winner
Always,
Sinri.
always.
Like, we are calling these names of these women who were always doing the work. Yeah. Not just talking the work. In fact,
They were
sometimes they didn't
working
talk the
women.
work at all.
The group was working women, but they are always working women.
Yeah. All the time. Working women. Yeah. I think it's important to name them, to remember them, to honor the work that they've done. And it's so funny, as you started talking, there's this mental health professional, her name is Julianne Taylor Shaw, and she talks about the work that mental health practitioners do is undoing aloneness. Like, whatever theoretical lens you want to take, whatever modality you're using, what we essentially try to do is undoing aloneness, right? So people come when they're in crisis, and when we're in crisis, we feel alone. Um, and I haven't made the connection between that part of my life and my life as a researcher. And as you started to talk about the work that Winner does when it goes in to have these conversations, it's undoing aloneness. And then when we talked about what do we need to do to manage the emotional labor of this work, it's also doing aloneness. Like when Nadine has that conversation about, all right, this is what we have done today. She is saying, you are not alone. We are not alone in doing this work. We're going out there, and we're telling people in the community, you're not alone. And so a lot of that is witnessing, and witnessing does not require instruction. A witness doesn't require that. It doesn't require me telling you what to do. It's saying, I see you.
Lade Mututo.
And I see you, and now you're not alone.
She says, very often, women want to hear their thoughts. Issues of gender-based violence, they want to say something, and I want to bounce it off of you. They don't need me to say XYZ, but I want to hear what you think. And she always says, again, the first thing I want to do is make sense of what would a public policy response look like? One that says, come here, say what you have to say. What would that look like? And I think as we work through the work, as we try to make sense of what is it we're doing, I believe that we had glimpses of it. We had the 22 drop-in centers where people would just come and be able to sit and talk. And when you go into communities now, I hear that in Trinidad. I hear people asking for spaces for people to come and sit. And I honestly think we will get there. But it's not the solutions. I need to hear my thoughts. I need to hear my thoughts. And what is public policy? What is that public policy response? What does that look like?
As we start to wind down, I want to ask you this question for you to think about. What is still dangerous, sacred, or unspeakable about this work?
What is dangerous for us? And I think we have to start thinking real hard about it. When we talk about gender-based violence, we double down into domestic violence and intimate partner violence. We don't spend a lot of time on child sexual abuse. And if we're honest, we're going to have to start to think about our high incidence of teenage pregnancy in the context of child sexual abuse regionally. But we're not talking it. We don't talk it. We're comfortable with the idea of that data set that tells us teenage pregnancy. We're not making sense of the data set that tells us that our children are the most at-risk group in terms of their home life. We would police them in school when they act out. But we have to begin to make sense of the whole child. We still silence on that. You know, what's the other thing we silent?
You say that, Deborah. Let's get to the other thing, because you said that, and I think for us to approach that dangerous territory, we have to also interrogate, confront the way we talk about adolescent bodies, both male sexed adolescent bodies and female sexed adolescent bodies. All of these cultural things that we do when we talk about teenage pregnancy, and that's a threshold, right? We are not ready
But
to confront
Tracy, you know what?
ourselves.
We even less likely to confront the number of us adults walking around as survivors. And we're just barely surviving it. So a while ago, Jackie Burgess was talking to me. She said to me, and Jackie Burgess is one of the first coordinators of the Rape Crisis Center in Trinidad and Tobago. She continues to do work around women's issues. She's the coordinator of the network of NGOs for the advancement of women. And she said to me, when they first set up Rape Crisis, and they sat down and they said, well, we waited for the rape cases to come. She said the first set of women who came were adult women who said, you know, I was raped many moons ago and I didn't know I was raped. I thought that was a matter of course. And so for me, there's a way in which the adolescent bodies and also the Caribbean could be a very violent space. There's an article Professor Barrington writes, but a big chunk of our violence is the violence in relationships. And those rites of passage that many times boys and girls become vulnerable. Boys and girls become vulnerable.
I feel like that's a whole other conversation by itself, right?
What is sacred in this region is our stories and the ways in which we are able to capture those stories. I think that is sacred. Women's stories, men's stories. what made women visible in this region was the Woman in the Caribbean project led by Justin Messiah. They really went for women's stories. So for me in this region, I'm always mindful of how secret stories are and our responsibility to carry them. And I think that's what the book was about, Tracie. Those stories. We were able to really carry some stories, and it is honorable to be allowed to carry stories. So that is what is sacred to me.
Thank you so much, Deborah. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I want to invite you as we close to sort of name the emotional location that we are at now. What are you honoring? What are you holding?
This work that we do, I'm honoring hope. I'm always full.
You have been listening to Saltwater Reasonings, where we sit with the currents of care, struggle, and knowing otherwise. My deep thanks to Deborah McFee for this thoughtful and uncompromising reasoning. This conversation reminds us that research with women who have experienced violence is never neutral. It is relational, emotional, and political work that requires courage, humility, and an ongoing commitment to accountability. We have reflected on the risks and tensions that accompany proximity, on the emotional labor and secondary trauma carried by researchers, and on the ethical imperative to center dignity, safety, and solidarity in both research and writing. This episode asks us to consider what remains when the study ends, but the harm persists, and what responsibilities we continue to carry long after we leave the field. To learn more about this episode and the wider Saltwater Reasonings listening library, visit tracie.rogers/Saltwater Reasonings. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me for the next tide in this series as we continue to reason at the edges of research, community, and care.